Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 653. I'm Tom Quigley. Today, work entry and introduction. This essay focuses on what work entry is and why it's the single most important part of determining whether a team is dependable, predictable, and even remotely agile. We also have a visit from Jon M Quigley and his Alpha and Omega of product development. Jon and I discuss, wrestle, chew on how the idea of a product backlog can exist in a project environment. Work Entry and Introduction by Thomas M. Quigley Jr., Megan E. Quigley. How work enters an organization or teams is almost always a touchy subject. For many, it's the root of the pressure on teams to do more than they are consistently capable of, or at least without cutting corners. Many teams, leads and managers struggle with work entry, causing them to ask who is responsible. My knee-jerk reaction would have been to hold up a mirror. They do bear at least some responsibility. But ownership of the problem has to be placed on the doorstep of senior leadership. Several factors make it difficult or unsafe not to accept work that is pushed to a team. 1. The method that each level of organization is being incented. Bonuses, other incentives that prioritize output over outcomes leads to the tendency to say yes as much work as possible and then to cut corners to make it happen. Problems such as technical debt are ignored or spun to be someone else's problem. People will generally do what they think is in their financial best interest. 2. The insistence that teams continuously improve, led by leaders who punish experiments that fail. Safety to try new ideas is critical for improvement. Punishing failures will lead to playing it safe and reducing innovation, which means that the team will get more done by cutting corners than by trying new things. 3. Someone else will always say yes. I recently overheard a manager tell a team that they were not being team players when they indicated they would not have the capacity to do a piece of work for a sprint or two. The manager pointed out that the team of contractors down the hall would be glad to tackle the work. So why did he need this team? 4. Leaders leverage mismatches of power to get to yes. I followed the manager down the hall after the discussion I'd overheard in number 3 and listened as they pressured the team of contractors to take the work. The words, "I will remember your answers when we renew the contract," were actually uttered to the entire room. Mismatches of power preclude saying no. When the manager asked who owned work entry problems, the answer had to start with senior leadership because they create and own the culture of the organization. Their words and actions need to match if the organization wants to be agile or have an agile mindset. Senior leaders need to foster the environment that makes controlling the flow of work safe. Begin by changing how leaders in the organization are paid and incented. Senior leadership owns the culture. Senior leadership ownership of the culture does not let other leaders off the hook, though, or even the teams themselves. Everyone in the decision chain needs to understand the implications of saying yes and agreeing to a delivery date without understanding other agreements already in the pipeline and what the team really can deliver. Remember that Fred Brooks in the Mythical Man Month proved that adding manpower to a late software project makes it later. Just because we're using sprints or iterations hasn't changed Brooks' message that saying yes to everything is a prescription to disaster. Senior leaders, you own it, fix the culture. Even a simple definition of work entry is full of implicit and explicit assumptions based on the type of work, team, organizations involved. Understanding work entry requires grasping 4 concepts. 1. Push versus pull. 2. Story-driven versus interrupt-driven. 3. utilization maximization fallacy, and 4, flow. Pull and push are simple 4-letter words, and sometimes used as invectives as other more infamous 4-letter words are. But these words are not always understood. In software-centric organizations, a simple operational definition of pull is teams accept new work when they have the capacity to do it and the work has a reasonable chance of progressing to done without interruption. Work is pulled by the people doing the work based on the capacity of the system. I recently heard a configuration specialist in a Scrum team say, "I asked the product owner what's next on the backlog when we have the capacity to do more work." The conversation is a good indication of a pull work environment. Push is the opposite of pull, reflecting a situation where work is given to people and teams based on arrival of the work or demand rather than capacity or flow considerations. A number of years ago, I worked for a consulting firm that used a push process between sales and delivery. The salespeople sold the work and then pushed the sold work directly into delivery, usually with a promised start and end date. Story-driven and interrupt-driven teams have to manage their work queues differently. Prioritized backlogs are a feature of story-driven teams. Requirements, while they may be dynamic, reflect market needs. Operational support teams are often interrupt-driven. Work comes to the interrupt-driven teams in an unpredictable fashion. I recently helped a large team supporting a large ERP package that was having fits meeting commitments they were making to their clients. The team would diligently plan a sprint, story-driven work, only to have tickets from incidents, interrupt-driven work, disrupt their plans. We split the team into 2 components, one using a Scrum approach, the other one using a Kanban-y form of Scrumban. Many organizations require teams and leaders to plan for maximizing capacity utilization by planning people, often called resources in that scenario, at 100% capacity. This approach pushes work to each step in the process without regard to constraints and bottlenecks, yielding lots of work started but less work completed. The focus on planning 100% utilization in software teams is potentially counterproductive because it generates planning errors and compression. All systems, human or mechanical, have a capacity. Flow is the amount of value that travels through a process in a specific time. Flow is often measured as a function of pace and consistency. A predictable flow is influenced by how much work enters, how well the work is triaged, and how well the team exploits the constraints in the system. Work entry is not an esoteric discussion. Real problems occur when we get it wrong. Herding is an example of poor work entry behavior. Herding is a pattern where an individual or team acts based on the behavior of others. Stated very simply, herding is just like the children's game Follow the Leader. Last year, I sat in on a discussion in an organization where being perceived as being helpful was a significant attribute for bonuses and performance. The R&D group, software development in this case, had recently been asked to implement a significant SaaS package with a due date before Thanksgiving so that the retail portion of the business would not be impacted. Makes sense. The date was absurd. The CIO had gathered a number of teams together to determine if the work was doable. The answer from each team as they went around the room was no, until a single team said they could do it. In a quick succession, everybody changed their mind and played Follow the Leader. All of the affected teams exhibited herd behavior. As soon as one team broke from the pack, everyone followed. The cascade was exacerbated when the CIO muttered, "Thank you," to the first 2 teams that said yes. Herding in decision-making effectively took no off the table. This type of behavior is response-driven. Herding is often a response to fear and uncertainty. Animals herd as a protection mechanism. Herding makes it more difficult for predators to take advantage of an individual. Herding plays a similar role in decision making. In our example, until one team broke the pattern, everyone had the same answer. Everyone was being equally unhelpful. As soon as one team broke ranks, and at least one team followed, it became easy to brand teams saying no as not team players, which increased risk. Following the leader in the circumstance can be viewed as rational economic behavior. Signaled social influence triggers herding. Humans modify their behavior to adapt to the environment. Peer pressure and socialization are tools to send signals that establish behavioral boundaries. In our example, the CIO's muttered comment was an explicit signal, an application of influence to the other teams to change course. The policies that establish perceived helpfulness as an important input into the organization's review process generate subconscious guidance for acceptable behavior. By the way, the project ended up being pretty close to a catastrophic failure, and an outside team was later, or a group of outside teams later were brought in, and several people fired. Herding occurs in almost every human endeavor. Behavior is not prima facie good or bad. However, when playing follow the leader takes away the ability to control work entry, the flow of work can bottleneck and slow to a crawl. Teams can't say no when it makes sense, will find it difficult to deliver value consistently. All teams and programs must have a process for gathering and accepting work. In Scrum, a typical work entry process might be 1. People write stories or requirements in varying quality. Those stories are evaluated and cleaned up. Updated, well-formed stories are added to the backlog. Once on the backlog, stories are prioritized and then reprioritized over time. And in time, the stories are pulled into the sprint or removed and not done. The product owner owns the backlog and a prioritization problem. He or she works with the team to determine when an item is to be done. A poor work entry process allows anyone to give work to a team at any time. When they tackle work, they tackle based on their perception of value and urgency and importance. While this sounds crazy, ad hoc work entry is more common than most leaders know. Just to be clear, when work is pulled into a team in an uncontrolled manner, the team will not be able to efficiently or effectively deliver value to the organization. The same issues occur at a program and portfolio level. Disciplined programs and teams fiercely control how work is accepted. No individual, team, or organization can support ad hoc work entry approach over the long run without having to accept an enormous amount of risk. A disciplined approach to work entry evaluates and prioritizes work to ensure that the most important and urgent work is done before other work. At a team level, undisciplined work entry has many effects. The top are 1. Disrupted work. Pushing the work into a team after planning is an interruption. Interruptions disrupt the current flow of work and thought within a team. Consider how you are impacted if you're in the middle of a piece of work or concentrating on reading a wonderful blog article at tomkegley.com and someone asks you to do something else. Interruptions reduce effectiveness and efficiency because they require rework. Maybe not rework in coding or testing in every case. There is always a disruption in the process of knowledge work, thinking, creating, considering, collaborating. Interruptions cause knowledge workers to have to remember where they are in diagnosing a problem, how they were thinking about solving the problem, and what they were going to do next. The longer the interruption, the bigger the impact. 2. Everything is late. When a team is asked to deal with new pieces of work outside the standard process, other items that are currently being addressed will have to be stopped for some period of time. Just stopping one piece of work will cause a ripple effect unless each developer can perform all the tasks needed without support or collaboration. Reduce trust. The worst impact of an undisciplined work entry process is the loss of trust between team members, stakeholders, and leadership. Loss of efficiency and late deliveries on committed work breaks the bond of trust between the team and the rest of the organization. In the long run, the loss of trust has huge side effects. Teams and organizations need to obsess about controlling work entry. Not to be too Pollyanna-ish just about doing the work on the backlog. There will always be urgent and important items that appear on the horizon that need to be dealt with. Unplanned work, though, should be rare for most development programs or teams. The work entry process needs to be tuned to be able to deal with those type of items without causing undue disruptions to the team. Thoughts, comments, all welcome. Please feel free to reach out to us at spamcastinfo@gmail.com or directly at tcagley@tomcagley.com. Jon M Quigley, author, pundit, and the bringer of the alpha and omega of product development column to the Software Process and Measurement Cast. Welcome back, sir.
Nice to be back again, Tom. Glad to be talking with you again.
Jon, tonight, let's talk about a product backlog in a project environment. You know, we talk about having a product backlog and how people can pull from it, and the product that gets built out. How does that work in a project environment where things are over and over discontinuous?
Right, or formally guided by a project plan or scripted in the course of a Gantt chart. Right, this happens, then right behind that is this, and then right behind that is this. And they're all connected in this way.
Absolutely. Well, yeah.
A lot of
albeit now we might have a product roadmap that does a lot of the same things.
Yeah, exactly. But if you've ever, I've worked in some companies where I've made the maximum use of a Gantt chart, as in every item that was required to some measure of detail might not be down to the smallest level. And when you do that, you end up with a time plan for the most moderate of complex projects to be quite substantial. I mean, hundreds of lines of tasks to do. And what I found recently, first of all, I've been thinking, along with a guy named Rick Edwards, we've been thinking that a pure conventional approach to project management, like what you would see at PMI, that maximum model, is not necessarily the best for every situation. And maybe neither too is a purely agile approach. It sort of depends on things like the organization's culture, right? There's no sense in trying to we've talked about this before, there's no sense in trying to bring an agile approach to the work when the company is command and control oriented. It's a waste of time. You're just wasting time, and you're gonna make people irritated, probably.
Maybe it's good that they get irritated.
It might be. You're right. It might be. So, but in general, we were thinking that a mashup of the two is, for example, nobody tells a project manager that he should. There's nowhere in PMI that says a project manager should sit at his or her desk, and look at Excel sheets or Gantt charts. There's nothing that says don't go to your team every day and talk about the stuff they're working with which they're working. So what I have been doing recently, probably the last 2 years, is instead of going to creating this huge detailed schedule, is creating a line item for a particular collection of things, right? This one item actually consists of all these little tasks. And so we look at the one item as maybe a list in the Gantt chart, but the little task, the subtask, would go on to something like a product backlog. So what are we doing today? This is the minutia that we need to get done in the next today or by tomorrow or whatever that short time period is.
Mhm.
And when that's completed and you can verify that's complete, you pull off and you can actually have more work added in process because you have taken something that is no longer in process. So you can take the workload. You take the next thing off like you would for an agile backlog product, sprint backlog.
So what got you to this point? What got you to combining and hybridizing both approaches?
I see people on one side of the fence or the other, like that's the only way to do the work. And some of the stuff that I've done suggested that that's not entirely true. You can see how in an automotive company, you probably need to have automotive product development, depending on the product, the component. You probably need a little more traceability and control over the documentation than you would in some other instances. So you have to kind of treat that a little differently. But when you look at some of these Gantt charts or PERT charts for a project, I think it's
PERT CPM, baby,
can get to be something that makes you just get glossed over. What's good about it is, assuming you've got the dependencies correct, more or less, and you keep track of it, it kind of can predict some things about the end date because of the critical path, right? So there's some interesting things there that can be fairly worthwhile. But in general, I don't like thinking of things it's either this or that. That I think that there's benefit to be had from mashing things up, and the speed at which you can make things happen to be agile, co-location, and the team constantly talking about what they're working on. You see that if you've done that purely agile approach, you've seen that pace that you can achieve, and not to mention what it does for this collection of individuals. You sort of start thinking this should be co-opted wherever you can, even in conventional approaches.
But what if you have to tell every one of those people every day what they're supposed to be doing?
That's really not how that works. And it shouldn't work like that in conventional approaches either. The project manager is not the person doing the work. Project manager owns maybe a piece of this pie, as in the schedule and the customer, some parts of the customer's desire for the schedule and defense of those things, or to kind of push that envelope a little. But in my role when I've been a conventional project manager, I don't dictate. This is what you do and this is how you do it. I say this is the objective, and this comes from the customer. This is the scope of this work, and this also comes from the product owner. So how are we going to do this, fellas and ladies?
So let's get back to the product backlog, though. So we have a product backlog that has all of the wants and needs at any given time for a product. And as we both have explored over the past few years, that can be somewhat dynamic. Hopefully it isn't volcanically dynamic. But even then, that happens on occasion, right? So if we're pulling work off of that from a project perspective and saying, okay, we have this project now that's going to take this group of things off of that backlog, and it's going to have a start and end, and given the sort of that project construct that says, well, now we have our scope, what happens if it changes? Or does that, like a sprint, is that like fixed for whatever the length of the project is?
It can be. That's where there's some downside, especially in the automotive world. If you're spending a lot of money on tooling and you have the design you thought solid, so when somebody wants to introduce some change request as you are maybe undergoing this tooling, spending $50,000, $110,000 on a hard tool to be able to produce millions of parts, then you kind of limit the amount of stuff that can be done if the change has something to do with that tool, obviously. And if your contract is for some kind of, is not really fixed, but it's engineering time, NREs accrued is part of the contract, and you end up adding more NRE to it, then there's going to be some negotiation about what happens next. It's not definitely a no. The only part it gets to be difficult is when tooling's involved and things are a lot less flexible. if you've already spent the tooling money, at least when it comes to that part of it.
It goes back to that famous consultant's answer to everything. So it depends.
Yes.
But I think what you've said is it depends perhaps on what you're working on and your ability to change. Obviously,
the contract type and what the customer's expectations are, and probably risks that are inherent in the design and development project and the end product as well. Right? It's like a stew. And the person that can look at all the things that they have, what you need is a set of tools and techniques available to you, and look at the circumstances and pick the right approach based on that.
So we're saying that the amount of change that anything can absorb is really dependent on a number of different attributes and variables. And therefore, just blanket saying we will accept change instantaneously, even up to the day we deliver, may make sense in an intangible product. But if you're dealing with something that's far more tangible, parts, tooling, things like that, that becomes less possible.
I just recently had a customer. We had a project. We have a project. The product was coming up to it's time to start securing the tooling money. We're going to have one last look at this, and but by all accounts, we're good to go. And then the customer, in putting this model in with other models that were part of this vehicle, like this part fits against this part, and they put the two pieces together, and then they realize, we have a problem with this particular feature of the part. It stuck out in a particular way that created an interference fit with some other pieces and some maintenance work. So about the time we were getting ready to say, okay, let's secure the money for the tooling, they're like,
no,
time out. Can you do this without changing the tool? And we're like, tooling expert? And the tooling expert's like, no. And it's even worse than that, because we were looking at using an existing tool and making a minor adaptation, an insert for it, and cutting some time and some costs that way. And the change essentially said, we can no longer use this existing work. We got to start from scratch.
Super. Jon, thank you for educating the software process and SPaMCAST listeners on the nuances of product development. Most of the listeners, or many of the listeners, live in a software world where they don't have any or don't have the same complications as living in a hard product like an automotive world. So thank you again for bringing your alpha and omega of product development to the software process and SPaMCAST.
Tom, as always, pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to that March hail date. That'll be a lot of fun.
In Reread Saturday news, we have read or reread Fixing Your Scrum, Practical Solutions to Common Scrum Problems by Todd Miller and Ryan Ripley, cover to cover. That's if you don't count the index at the back of the book, and I certainly do not. As a wrap-up, I briefly consider 3 points that came to mind during the reread. If you've not bought your copy, use the link in the show notes, buy a copy, go back over the 16 weeks that we reread, and enjoy the book. Next week, we will start our reread of Monotasking by Stefan Nottenberg. By laying out an approach, I'm contemplating combining the reread with experience reports as I try to put the ideas in the book to use. More on that next week. Again, link in the show notes, get a copy of that, and get reading. Speaking of monotasking, in the next podcast, we'll feature the interview I did with Stefan, covering the book that we're about to reread. We discussed how to apply the ideas in the book to improve focus, productivity, and quality of life. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?